Hey everyone, welcome to my second poker vlog. This was a short session between some weekend chores. It only lasted about 90 minutes, but even though it was pretty short, I had some pretty enjoyable hands that I think make for some entertaining content. Especially the last two hands of my session were quite interesting. I'm excited to show off some of the play style that I've been trying to work into my game. So I don't want to give too much away. Let's just take a look at what happened. I started the session with $200 sitting at 1-2 no limit with bomb pots. For my very first hand, I'm dealt ace-jack suited in hearts. There's two limpers, and I raised to $10 in the cutoff. I get four callers, bringing the pot to $52. The flop comes ace-ace-queen with two diamonds. After everyone checks to me, a continuation bet for $35 more. I don't want any draws to get a free turn, and if someone's holding the case ace, I want to charge them. It turns out no one's interested though, as everyone folds and I happily pick up my first pot of the day. Thank you. For this next hand, I'm dealt jack 3 suited in spades. There's an under the gun straddle for $5. Two players call, and given that I already have $2 in the pot as the big blind, I decide to call for 3 more, bringing the pot to $21. The flop comes ace of spades, queen of diamonds, 4 of spades, giving me a flush draw and a backdoor straight draw. The in position player bets $18, about 85% of the pot size. I consider for a bit, and I plan to fold simply due to the bet size, the small pot, and my being out of position. As I'm about to fold though, I notice the player across the board broadcasting his intent to call by counting out $18 in chips in front of his stack. Knowing that his call will give me better odds, I end up making the call as well. And it turns out my interpretation was accurate, as the player counting his chips does end up making the call as well, bringing the pot to $75. The turn brings the 2 of diamonds, not improving my hand. It checks around to the original bettor, who pushes all in for $113, well over the pot size. I imagine my flush draw is still good, but my pot odds aren't, so I fold. As we see, the river brings the 7 of hearts, and I would have missed everything. The original bettor shows 6-2 of spades for a flush draw as well, which missed his flush, but he did hit bottom pair on the turn.
This next hand is a PLO bomb pot hand. I'm sitting on the button. There's 8 players with flop, making the pot $40. The flop comes 10-10-9 rainbow on top, giving me trips with a gut shot straight draw. The bottom board comes 8-5-4 with 2 clubs, not really giving me anything but a very unlikely backdoor straight draw. The middle position player bets pot for $40. I call, hoping that my trips on top are best with king kicker, and 2 other players call as well. The pot is now $200. On the turn, we see the 2 of spades on top, which changes nothing for my hand. On the bottom, we see the queen of hearts, giving me a pair. I'm still just playing for the top board at this point. Everyone checks to me, so I assume my trip 10s are probably best on top, assuming no one is playing ace-10 passively. Given that everyone has slowed down, I push all in for $170, hoping to look strong despite having little on the bottom board, simply hoping for folds to scoop the pot at this point if I can. I'm not worried about calls, since I'm likely a favorite for the top board. The under the gun plus 2 player ends up calling. The pot's now $540. On the river, we see the 8 of diamonds on top, which again changes nothing for my hand there. The queen of spades comes on bottom, giving me a miraculous hand of trips on that board as well. I announce my hand, and my opponent mucks, giving me the scoop for $540. I didn't hear if he announced what he had, but I don't imagine I was scooping without that queen on the river. This next hand's another PLO bomb pot hand. I'm dealt ace-ace-5-4 with diamonds. I'm sitting in the cutoff. There's 9 players to the flop, making the pot $45. The flop comes king-king-9 rainbow on top, giving me 2 pair with my aces, but I have to assume I'm drawing very slim versus any king that any opponent holds. The bottom comes 10-8-7 with 2 diamonds, giving me an overpair with the nut flush draw, but given how wet the board is, it's pretty safe to assume another player already has a straight or 2 pair here, making it likely that I need to hit the flush to win. The player to my right bets $25. I call with my overpair, hoping for a chance to hit the flush draw on the bottom board. Unfortunately, the big blind check raised to $90, and the original bettor ends up re-raising the total pot on top. I imagine I'm behind on one, if not both boards, and decide to fold my flush draw and wait for a better spot. It turns out my read was correct, and even though I would have hit the flush, one player ends up showing a king for trips on the top board, and the other player shows 8-7 for 2 pair on the bottom. Next, I'm dealt pocket 7s. I'm second to act. I open raise to $7, and the player after me re-raises to $45. She's sitting with about $350 in her stack, but she seems to be a solid player who doesn't overplay hands. When it folds around to me, I decide to fold as well, hoping to find a better spot. For this hand, I'm dealt ace-king suited in spades. I'm sitting in middle position. The under the gun plus 1 player raises to $12, and the player to my right calls. I decide to re-raise to $50, and both players end up calling, bringing the pot to $153. The flop comes 3-3-2 rainbow. This feels like a board that both players very likely missed, so when it's checked to me in position on the flop, I have no problem making a strong continuation bet for $100. Both players fold, and I'm happy to pick up the pot without any resistance. Towards the middle of my session, I pick up my first big pocket pair, pocket queens. I'm sitting in the small blind. The under the gun player straddles for $4. Before the flop, the under the gun +1 player calls immediately following the straddler, as does the button. I raised to $20 from the small blind, which looking back was probably a small raise size given the straddle and calls. The under the gun +1 player calls and everyone else folds. The pot is $50. The flop comes ace jack 3 rainbow. I'm not thrilled to see an ace on the flop, but it's hard to assume my opponent has an ace given the fact that he limped first to act. I feel like betting here is the best option to determine where I stand. I lead for $25 and my opponent calls. The pot's now $100. The turn comes the 9 of clubs. It doesn't improve my hand or give me any additional outs. My opponent bets $50 and I call. The pot's now $200. The river card is the 8 of hearts. I check, planning to fold to a river bet. My opponent thankfully checks for a free showdown, and I'm shown ace-king for a pair of aces. For this next hand, I'm dealt ace-6 suited in diamonds. I'm sitting in the cutoff. Before the flop, the player to my right raises to $15. He's been raising a lot of hands pre-flop for large bet sizes, and also he's been talking my ear off about how he's only been playing unsuited connectors all day, and showing me several times as well. He's also got a massive stack sitting with about $2,000. Given that, I decide my ace could be good, and even if not, hitting a big hand could be rewarding versus this player, so I decide to call for $15. Unfortunately, the player on the button to my left ends up re-raising to $70. I noticed she has been making squeeze plays like this several times, but I have yet to see her showdown, and I did not have a hand that I would consider getting involved at this point. I fold my hand, keeping her squeeze plays in mind for future hands, which is the main reason I included this hand in the video. The very next hand I'm sitting with ace-9 offsuit in the hijack. The same player as before raises to $15, and although I have a hand that's likely ahead of his range, I don't want to get squeezed again. I also don't feel like this is a hand that's worthy of a re-raise, so I ultimately decide to lay it down. It feels a little weak, but I'm biding my time for a better opportunity. Later in the session, we have another bomb pot hand. I'm dealt ace-king 8-4 rainbow, and I'm sitting under the gun +2. There's 8 players to the flop. The pot is $40. The flop comes king 8-3 with 2 spades on top, giving me top 2 pair. The bottom board is 9-7-6, not helping my hand in any way. The player sitting in the small blind leads for $15. It folds to me, and I call with one other caller as well. The pot's now $85. The turn brings the ace of clubs on top, improving my 2 pair from kings and eights to aces and kings. The bottom brings a 2, doing nothing to help my hand. The small blind leads again for $40, and a call in hope of filling up on the top board on the river with an ace, king, or 8. Given the board and my holdings, I think it's likely that he's betting with a hand that's connected with the bottom board. The third player calls as well. The pot's now $205. The river brings the king of diamonds on top, giving me a full house, kings full of aces, which I have to assume is the best hand at this point. A 10 comes on the bottom, giving me nothing but ace high there. I'm playing for the chop at this point. When the small blind leads for $100 again, I consider that I have 2 options here. Option A, I could simply call in hopes of the third player calling as well, and splitting $50 from whichever player loses. Option B, given my strength on the top board, I feel like that hand is locked in for a win. I could use that strength to make a scary river bet in hopes of scaring both players out of the pot and scooping the whole thing. I decide that I prefer option B here, and so I raise all in for $385 total. The third player folds, as I had hoped, but unfortunately the original bettor makes the call, and as expected, we chop the pot. For my second to last hand of the session, I'm dealt Jack-9 suited with clubs. I'm sitting under the gun +2. The same player to my right, who I mentioned earlier, raises to $20. I consider calling, as I want to be involved in some pots against this player, but I don't want to end up getting squeezed out of this hand by the same player to my left who has done so earlier. I decide this could be a deceptive hand to play strongly, so I make a move here and come over the top for $60. The player to my left makes it clear that she's in a tough spot and even says,
I cannot believe I'm folding this, but I fold.
she ends up folding a hand that probably would have resulted in another squeeze if I had called, which reinforces my decision up to this point. The original raiser calls, which I was expecting. The pot's now $123. Unfortunately, I failed to capture the flop here. However, I recall that I did not pair the board, and the flop was lower than what I held. No matter, as I intended to bet the flop regardless. My opponent checks to me and I quickly bet $80, about 2/3 of the pot. He folds quickly and is curious as to my holding, so I offer to show.
You can show if you want. Yeah. Nice and honest, but
This hand immediately follows the previous Jack-9 hand that I won as a bluff, which I showed to the player on the right, and has a big influence on how this plays out. I'm sitting under the gun +1 with ace-king offsuit. The player to my right straddles for $25. I immediately raise to $75, and it folds around to the straddler, who calls. The pot's now $153. The flop comes Jack 6-2 rainbow. My opponent checks to me. I expect that if I bet here, I would likely encounter some resistance given our interaction on the previous hand, and given that I haven't paired the board, I opt to check in hopes of improving. The turn thankfully brings an ace, giving me top pair. My opponent checks to me, and at this point I make several assumptions given what I know. First, I probably have my opponent beat. Betting here will only get a worse hand to fold. However, it could lead to my opponent check raising as a bluff. Even though he's splashing around in pots, he mentioned that he's a poker dealer elsewhere, and he's demonstrated that he's a competent player. I've played my hand like it's a one-pair hand, and he could easily play back at me, knowing that it would be hard for a one-pair hand to continue against a strong check raise. Lastly, if my opponent really does have nothing at this point, checking could lead my opponent to believe he has a chance of betting to steal the pot on the river, which is likely my best chance at extracting more money from this hand. Given all that, I decided to check behind. The river brings a queen, which is a little scary given all the paint on the board. However, when my opponent bets $75, I have to stick to the plan. I immediately call based upon my earlier assumptions. The pot's $303. My opponent shows a 10, and as I'm waiting for him to reveal a king for the backdoor straight, he thankfully flips over a 9 to go with his 10, revealing that he was bluffing at the pot as I had intended for my turn check. I turn over my hand and win the pot.
So that was a pretty good session. I bought in for 200. I played for about an hour and 45 minutes and cashed out for 705, so $505 winnings, not counting the hourly cost and the membership fees and what have you. Had a couple of big bomb pot hands, had some really nice holdem hands that I was able to bet people out and read pretty well. One that was costly, but didn't know enough about the opponent to fold, but overall, I'm happy with the results. We'll take a closer look at them, in the video.